condition, but also the economics strain. And then you'll hear me talk more about economics through some of the experiences that San Diego is experiencing, because rate changes are top of mind for a lot of our residents and businesses right now. And so I wanted to share that again, the perspectives that I'll be presenting on are tools that my department, the Environmental Service Department, has received. We're fortunate that the city has a dedicated division of race and equity, and they provide deliberate steps towards advancing racial and social equity in San Diego, towards having a more inclusive and equitable outcomes so we can have thriving communities. And so, their role is to help coach and partner with all the city departments, provide them tools and guidance and technical assistance to help them reconsider how we redesign our systems. And that core approach looks at things like community engagement, how to use data-driven practices, learning and development, so that we're also building staff and capacity internally. And equity is not just with the community, but also internal as well. And how do we build those strategic partnerships? Most of the conversation I'm going to be focusing on today is mostly about community engagement. And so a lot of this is also driven, what you see on your screen here is that late last year, we also developed an inclusive public engagement guide. It's available online, where it has tools and resources of how to engage with the city, but also the city's approach for how we engage back. So if this is a tool that might be helpful for you, and highly encourage it. And there's a lot of things that you see on my screen here are pulled from that resource guide. I would imagine maybe many folks have seen some of this image. And for those, I think we can all unclick, but is there anything that stands out from this image that you see here on your screen? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any thoughts, or put something in the chat.
I just like how the justice is where everyone is able to see and those barriers are removed.
Yeah, great observation. And you may have seen this as a demonstrated example of there's different kinds of, when we talk about, equality, equity, and justice, they're different, right? And so, the reality for some is that they may need more than have more than others, right? So folks are seen further into the field in this case, right? Versus some don't have any boxes at all. And in equality, it's assuming that everyone's just going to get the same benefits and same resources, but are expected to get the same treatment, even if they're at certain heights. And for example, in this image, well, equity is getting the support that they need based on the resources that are needed to be able to achieve that, to be able to see over that fence. And like Kaylin mentioned, that justice is where you can see that, all the supports and accommodations are there and provided, so that all the barriers have been removed for that systematic approach. And so, I'm not going to go into every term here, but just want to ground ourselves too, that the terms I'm referring to are terms that the city of San Diego has used to help have that equity lens, that, we're essentially asking ourselves specific questions, so that we're being really critical and thoughtful about how our decisions impacts budgets, and what those outcomes are, and if they are equitable, to essentially, looking at opportunities, and what does that mean for access, right? But that our goal is, and we're recognizing that there's, institutionalized racism systems and disparities that are in place, and, recognizing that is an important step in the process. And so I can imagine we all agree that, these inclusive, part of this includes inclusive engagement, right? And this matters because, it reduces the barriers and expands who's actually engaging, right? If it's just one way. But also importantly, this community feedback leads to folks being more informed and, being involved in the decision-making process, but also really building that trust and improving the relationships with the public. I don't know about all of you, but here in San Diego, public trust is very sensitive. It's more than ever, right? We have things like, there's already social media, folks, when we have myth busting of even just talking about recycling, I'm sure folks have shared, may have shared with you like climate change isn't real, or that's not what I heard on the internet. But even the voice of who the information comes from, because of things that are happening at the federal level, I have employees who literally, um, when they're talking to the public, they don't, folks don't care if they're coming at a federal level, local level, or nonprofit. You know, there's a lack of trust right now more than ever, and improving that relationship is important. So we'll talk more about what that looks like. There's also operational efficiencies. By going, I like to think about trust is based, or the speed of trust, right, helps impacts operations. And sometimes when we go so fast, we may be missing some important steps of involving folks where this impacts. And so really making sure that's consistent when you're considering your engagement process. And again, we know that the value of providing that input helps reflect what the community values and actually needs. So you're probably thinking, all right, Andrea, got the basics. What's going on in San Diego? How can we consider maybe things that you're working on or thinking about in your own programs or in your personal and professional life? And I want to ground us also in reminding us, I think it's important to meet people where they are, right? So diverse groups have diverse needs, and our consideration is when we talk about public participation, traditionally what you see is on the left, right? It's a one-way, some entity or organization is just going to spit out a whole bunch of information, pump it out to the public, and expect them to receive it and just get it right away, right? If that was the case, then all of our problems and issues with climate change and zero waste issues would be probably not here, right? But instead, my team is trying to work more on is more of the right-hand side of the public engagement, in which processes go in both ways, where we're also taking the time, but also creating systems where we can receive that feedback and the input from the public, so we can get those different perspectives, so it's being factored into our decision-making process. And so I thought it might be helpful that to address maybe some of the barriers to participation that we've seen, at least in San Diego, and that maybe some things to consider for how to overcome that, that might be helpful for your programs or services that you're involved in. One barrier that we've seen is, awareness and understanding. A lot of what we see is that sometimes the community members may not be fully informed on even how to get involved in the first place, right? They don't know, where to get the information. It's not intuitive. It's only, provided on the internet, and we'll talk more about digital access. But, it's important to have strategies in different ways to help the public understand how to be engaged and why it's important. And so how to address that is, again, reminding ourselves that to share information across multiple communication channels, that, not just on the internet or digital, but that also using different tactics by asking the community how they would like to receive information is going to be really important. For example, in some communities, we've heard that, they like to have a trusted resource. This is for the Spanish-speaking community. They've shared with us that, they would like to have an official government official to be on the news, answering their questions, informing them why it's important, and why, how this is going to impact their families. And that was based on feedback we received through focus groups, but also talking to community-based organizations. Other barriers is, languages. Many of our cities that we live in California continues to grow in languages other languages other than English. And so ensuring that we're incorporating languages through translation and interpretation services, so written and also spoken, but also using different imagery and graphics to help demonstrate what we're trying to communicate, right? So using images that are easily recognizable, or colors that may inform, hazards or dangers, right? Something red and orange, we've seen that, tends to be something that people recognize, and having consistency of colors I know many of us kind of work in the space of recycling and composting. And so the more consistency we have, that kind of green and blues or gray and blacks for trash, that consistency is going to help be understood across different languages. We also have limited access to technology as a barrier, the digital equity. And we see that especially during the pandemic, where we were sharing a lot of information over the internet quickly through social media. But what we found in our communities is that, especially elderly residences or folks where Wi-Fi is limited, that they wanted other methods to receive communication. We found this even more transparent. About 2 years ago, the city of San Diego experienced an unprecedented storm that flooded many neighborhoods and wiped out Wi-Fi access. And so we had to go back to knocking on doors, printing out materials, leaving printed materials at hotels, parks and recs and libraries, posting things on coffee shops. So again, just realizing that there are other sometimes benefits of having traditional forms of media of print to help engage in folks and not to only rely on technology only. I want to also recognize that sometimes there's structural inclusion that helps prevent folks from being able to participate. I'll give the example of transportation, right? Sometimes the location of where you want to have people engage, maybe you're having a workshop or a community event or even offering a tour of your facility, how people arrive there and leave there, and even just daylight and safety are all things that are really important to consider, and that sometimes that location create barriers and access only to certain communities and not easily to others. So things to consider is creating that welcoming environment. For example, we heard for some of our elderly residents, they didn't like having events in the evening, that walking in the dark was not favorable to them. And so in communities that especially had elderly residents, we moved our locations to be in parks and so rec centers or libraries, places that people recognize, and also was during the daytime. But we also knew that, for example, support such as having food easily available or childcare available. So for some of our workshops, kind of after hours, we have also offered that as an option to help increase participation and to remove the barriers. It's hard to say no to free food and drinks, especially when trying to talk to residents during their normal meal time. So having that available to bring people together is really important. And also ideally working with a local restaurant or catering company to feature them too is a great way to partner with the community, and also with community organizations. Another barrier to consider is time limitations. Sometimes, people are often juggling many competing demands between their jobs, their families, school, work, and other just basic day-to-day needs. And so sometimes the time and energy that's needed is maybe asking a lot for some. And so recognizing that there needs to be some options available. So things to consider is, if it's a quick survey, even modifying the survey to have two options, right? If it's an online survey, a paper survey, we've offered sometimes online surveys that are just 3 to 5 questions, and then ask them if they have more time, they can opt to answer more questions. But if they only have time for a handful, great, thanks for their time. But also offering again different times of the day that I mentioned earlier about the workshops or webinars, or even versus weekends versus weekdays, or things that really are important to consider for different communities. And last thing, I want to talk through about and around trust, right? Sometimes trust can be a reflection of people's cultural experiences. We have heard from some of our communities that the country or community they came from before was in a place where they did not trust government, that sometimes a lot of misinformation and propaganda is something that they experience in their lived experiences. And so coming to America, they're hesitant to communicate or talk to someone from government. So it's really important to provide that transparency, also partner with groups or individuals that have a history of trust with that community. What that looks like, for example, is that, for us, we sometimes partner with a community-based organization where the community-based organization is helping to promote or provide the main messaging, and the city staff are there to provide answers or questions. Um, but trust also can be, a lot of folks sometimes will share that they give feedback and they're like, well, where's this information going? How do I know it's being used, right? So communicating not only how they can provide input, but also sharing the steps of how is the information going to be used, how is it going to be available, and when is it going to be available, so that the public can know, if something's being rolled up into a report, when can they be able to view or access that? It's something that we've heard that's been requested in our communities. Um, and I mentioned here about creating a more comfortable engagement environment, adopting a trauma-informed approach, and welcoming diverse perspectives. And this is something that was new to me to learn more about. And what this is referring to is that this is recognizing that sometimes there's deep um, history or racism that some individuals or communities are experiencing. And so recognizing that sometimes the things that are going to be brought up in some of the engagement process might be triggering to some folks. And that's important to consider the approach that you want to take in the response. And I'll give the example of maybe, I've been in some workshops where a resident is clearly very upset and angry, and their voice is escalating, their body language is getting more hostile. And in this case, they may just appear angry to me, but they also can just be in a really loud environment. In this case, we were in a smaller room and it just happened to be everyone's voices were escalating. So this person had to raise their voice at me. But really, it was just because it was a loud environment. They were feeling frustrated. English was not their first, language. So they were raising their voice, but that person was not angry. I just perceived it as anger. And so how to address the situation is that I asked the resident luckily had someone who spoke the language of this woman. I asked if we could step outside so where it was quieter for us to speak. I asked if she felt comfortable speaking to the interpreter instead of myself. And that immediately kind of de-escalated that perceived anger from that resident, and also showed trust of like that she could tell that I was trying to listen to her, that I was taking the time to move her into a space that felt more comfortable for her. Um, and lastly, I want to just mention about attire and how important that is. I'll be transparent, and I shared this experience with Zinsi that, for example, I have co-compliance officers who are in the community enforcing on different policies and requirements, and we lead with education, but that presence can also seem threatening or concerning to some, especially when we're in spaces of working in alleys and looking at dumpsters. Sometimes we're talking to janitorial staff. Sometimes we're in the kitchens and back of house. And in San Diego, ICE is present. We have unmarked vehicles. We have folks in their agencies who are wearing unmarked clothing. For us, the community cannot always tell which agency is who, even in similar spaces. And so for us, it's been really important that we always have employees who wear clearly visible branded attire that identifies them with the city of San Diego, that we have our name badge with us, we have business cards, and we also have flyers to explain why we're out there in the community, so that if there's any misinformation or hesitation to work with us, we're showing them that clearly which agency we work at. But that's the reality of where my team is at. Hopefully, again, maybe your groups are not experiencing that, but something to just take in consideration, that something that seemed so simple before as knocking on doors and doing outreach for multifamily. We have hesitation for folks to open the doors or to even let us into their kitchens, to even just do a training, because they're concerned of what other agencies might be associated with us. So, reminding your staff, clearly introducing themselves, wearing attire that identifies who they're with, are going to be really important. I know I can talk on and on about more information, but I want to make sure I also give space and time for Mike. And I just want to share that I can give a copy of this presentation, that there are different also, questions and tools that have been helpful for my group to ask ourselves when we're planning and developing our outreach and engagement activities. Some of the questions you see here on the screen. We also have different factors that we also take into consideration, like access, assets, neighborhood demographics, what framework we want to use to have this. But also sometimes equity comes down to resources, and resources requires budget. And so we found it really helpful that we have our Division of Race and Equity has offered this kind of flow chart that helps us kind of, when we have to sometimes make tough choices about where money is going to be spent, using this flow chart to then determine what impacts this has to equity, but operations and any other adjustments and communication that's needed. And so lots of different examples of how we've used this through our outreach workshops, our transparency over sharing our results on our websites and in person and with the media. Here's an example of some activities that we had in person where if folks can also physically, they don't want to speak to us, can vote using these chips. Here's some examples of some fun, humorous kind of translated materials that we recently released about to increase green bin participation. And I mentioned a little bit about our door-to-door outreach and commercial outreach and resources and use of imagery. Last thing I just want to mention is that to help things also be transparent, to build that trust, we've added more steps on our website to share about our processes, like container checks, how do we define kind of contamination, and how to improve participation, and also provide translated materials online. And I'll end with, I know this is part of a much bigger discussion, but I welcome that if you have more thoughts or if you saw anything on the slide that you want to dive deeper on, please feel free to reach out to me. There's my email address. And I'm sure hopefully Zinzi, can also share this with your group so that you can send this as a PDF. But I'll pause there. And Zinzi, if we have time for questions, I welcome that.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. That was great. And yes, we can send out this presentation to everybody here. So I suppose let's just take one or two questions and then we'll let Mike speak and then we can hopefully have more discussion afterwards. Any questions?
I'm curious also. Oh, go ahead, Caitlin.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you for that presentation. It was amazing. I'm definitely going to be reaching out. I have a question. Have you ever had participants reach out and say, hey, I feel like this wasn't equitable for me? And if so, how did you respond to that?
Yeah, good question. I think it depends. For example, we were last year going through what we call our cost of service. So there was proposals of increasing rates to have better access to services and resources, but the workshops, we heard from some folks that, hey, it was in the evening. And so, for a lot of folks are like, it's hard for me to get there after work, or I'm putting my kid down, for daycare. So I think it's really listening in that case, we were listening and said, hey, we heard enough feedback and we asked the community, well, how would you like to receive the information? And that's where some folks said, hey, we would like the option of, an afternoon workshop, something on the weekend, a webinar. Some folks say, hey, can I just provide my information, get feedback through a survey? So I guess in that case, I don't have a one size fits all, but I think it's important to ask the community, well, how would you like to receive it, right? What's going to work best for you? And then taking that in consideration of like, do you have the resources and budget and staff to be able to implement that? Or things to consider.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
I'm curious for the group here, is there anything, are these questions or tools or things that you've used already in your personal or professional life? Or did anything from this kind of validate for all of you? See some head nodding.
I can jump in, Andrea. I thought it was really interesting what you brought up about multifamily outreach, since I think a lot of us in local government, are focusing on trying to be better about providing outreach to folks who live in multifamily properties, especially related to like 1383, and just the consideration now of how there is a new factor of folks not wanting to open the door and you see someone coming in looking official. And that is something that we need to consider. And that's not something that I'm sad to say I haven't really considered that. So thanks for bringing that forward. I think that's really valuable, especially with working in, like you said, BIPOC or disadvantaged communities who may be facing these additional challenges that we maybe personally are not facing in our day-to-day that should be taken into consideration when building these programs.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because we were doing multi-family door-to-door outreach. We started about 3 years ago. We had about everything from like a 40 to 45% door rate. It has decreased to 23%, just in the past year. We suspect it is due to things that are happening at the federal level and ICE and the presence in many of these communities that we're trying to reach. One thing that we've found helpful is that we always ask permission in advance of the property owner to be on site, and that we give them a little flyer, that little sign that says like, hey, the city is coming and we're going to come during these times. And then we also ask permission from the property owner. If someone doesn't answer the door, are we allowed to leave the materials at the door, or can we give it to you at the end of the outreach, and can you just distribute it yourself? Because they like more likely we trust the property owner, or sometimes depending on the size of the property owner wants to walk around with us. But again, asking the property owner in advance, how does your property feel more comfortable with us being here? Good points.
Yeah, really good points. Well, Andrea, let's just pause here for a second and we will let Mike speak, and then we'll come back and allow questions for the both of you. So yeah, Mike, are you ready? I don't know if you have a presentation or if
Yeah,
you
I have slides. It'll be
okay. Great.
Let me just. All right. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Well, thank you, Nikra, folks, for having me. My name is Mike Locke. I go by he, him. I'm currently field director of a statewide nonprofit network called AAPIs for Civic Empowerment Education Funds. I'll get into that. Also listing some of my other previous experience, not to make it all about me, but this is the second time I've spoken to a NECRA group. I spoke at the 2018 convening when I was staffing the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative. So I was talking about an adjacent EJ issue about chemical exposure and how to protect mainly Vietnamese nail salon workers from stuff. During that work, I used to say, hey, we were teaching folks what PPE was before COVID, and still are, when since you followed up with me and reached out, like, oh, we'd love you to speak again. And I was like, whoa, I didn't scare you all off the first time. But I hope to talk a little bit about some of the community engagement issues on the advocate side. Andrea did a good job of talking about how they're doing stuff in the city. A lot of things I could just on paper +1. I mean, all the things that Andrea said was really great. But just talking about some of the things from my experience and things with the organizations I work with. So again, not to make it all about me, but I was repurposing another slide deck. But I, for 8 years, worked with Asian Health Services in Oakland, which is a federally qualified health center that's been around for over 50 years, which now serves about 50,000 patients in 12 different Asian languages. It was during that time I got a chance to work on a variety of public health projects, including projects around pedestrian safety, this diagonal scramble crosswalk in front of one of our buildings. Unfortunately, the saying is true. There won't be a new stop sign unless somebody gets hurt or worse. Things that happen were related to collisions and deaths that happened in our community, and some of the organizing around it, which to try to do something about it. I again mentioned the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, which has top right corner, which has done a lot of advocacy on trying to improve conditions inside nail salons, particularly in areas of health and safety, chemical exposure, how chemicals have led to health, physical health and reproductive harms that have impacted, this industry, which is estimated to be about 70% Vietnamese, and by and large, women of color, most of whom are of childbearing age. Right? Also says that in my experience doing public health work, not just during my day job, in working and organizing with folks in the Oakland Chinatown area, I've been organizing these monthly volunteer cleanups in Oakland Chinatown for about 10 years. We've been doing it for, about 10 years, organizing different folks from the community, a multi-generational space. I also mentioned that is, sometimes we've gotten participation from, the state initiative Clean California, the local Adopt a Spot program, things like that. I know Earth Day is coming in. We get people, yes, obviously for the service holidays, MLK Day and Earth Day, we usually see a rise in volunteers. But we get folks, but we don't just go out during the service holidays. We're out there year round, we're consistent, and that helps us build credibility in the community. Also, public officials, like elected officials, wanting to work with us, and we didn't have to donate to their campaign in order for them to give us time of day. Just saying, right? A last picture just is me and my wife, our family with our 2 dogs. We're dog people. And I did just mention to Cincy that my wife, after a lot of work doing direct service, mainly in the domestic violence space, does DEI consulting for nonprofits, for public and private agencies. Not here to, I'm not throwing up a billboard on it or nothing, but just saying that, there are folks out there that do this work to help folks narrow in on how to do, DEI strategies, even in this climate. So again, I am now field director for AAPIs for Civic Empowerment Education Funds, or we have an AAPI Force is a really nice sounding acronym, but we are a statewide network that works with folks, mainly community-based organizations that work with low-income Asian communities and trying to come together on building statewide policy initiatives to help folks, social housing, environmental justice things. And also there have been things around tax reforms, and don't want to get into, but billionaires paying their fair share, that type of thing. You can see from the map is that we work with a variety of organizations up and down the states, not in every county, but these are the folks who we work with regularly, right? And just wanted to name a few. We were founded by the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which does a lot of great work in the East Bay. They were founded out of, Southeast Asian refugees who were experiencing health problems living in Richmond by the Chevron refinery, and has really, base builded off of that. And yeah, we work with a variety of folks. Also mentioning, in some of the communities you work with, just naming the Hmong communities in Sacramento and Fresno, the Sikh communities in Central Valley, Pacific Islander groups in Central Valley and other places. Some groups which oftentimes aren't considered in the mainstream when people think of Asian or Asian American communities. Either their groups are smaller, they haven't been here as long, they haven't, developed to the size and scope that has an ethnic enclave like a Chinatown or Little Saigon. But they are, finding ways to build community and do things like that. So kind of just breaking down what we do, but as we do, different policy advocacy and research, and we do different things around supporting organizations around both traditional and non-traditional ways of, reaching out to folks, phone banking, door knocking, things like that. When Andrea is mentioning their door-to-door rate and things like that, even my mom is like, I don't get why you do this work. I don't open the door to people I don't recognize or answer phone numbers that I don't recognize. But there are still people who do, right? And trying to do targeted work in these communities. For 501c3 nonprofits, we're oftentimes trying to reach out to the low propensity voters, the folks who don't always vote in elections. Politicians tend to reach for the folks who always or almost always votes, right? So trying to reach out for those hard to reach communities, which if they're hard to reach in voting, means that they're probably hard to reach or underrepresented in a lot of other types of, social services and things like that, trying to educate them about their rights and how to get them to show up. And, not just for voting, right? But I'm oftentimes in spaces like these and other places telling folks that when it comes to IVE and jargon giraffe, IVE is integrated voter engagement, but those IVE tactics are not just for elections. And what we say is that we work with specific organizations that do that base building work. And Andrea said they're trusted messengers, right? So building that. They're not just talking to folks 4 weeks before an election. That's kind of what the politicians do. They are focusing folks year round and engaging folks. So to be able to hopefully, among other things, inform folks about their rights, about government programs, about other things happening, right? This picture, I think, actually was during we were advocating for stuff around the Big Beautiful Bill or against the Big Beautiful Bill about, folks' rights with Medicaid or Medi-Cal, right? But again, important things, again, plus oneing, Andrea was saying about trust. You build that trust by being there and reaching out, year round, meeting them wherever they're at and things like that, and helping. That's how you get them to reach back. So just saying, and this is just based on hearing stuff from Cincy, and I'm just saying, this comes from a little bit of my experience in Oakland, and I'm not, saying, I'm not blanket saying this for all governments or public processes, but these are some of the things that also Andrea has kind of had mentioned, not trying to throw you, not trying to pull you with me, Andrea, but things like that, problems why sometimes underrepresented groups are not participating in a lot of these spaces, right? Whether it being like how public notice was given, lack of education or political education. We found, when I was doing stuff with the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, before even getting deep into like with Vietnamese nail salon workers and owners about like power analyses and how to do stuff, we had to get to the basics. Again, a lot of them don't have a high level of education either back home in Vietnam or here, right? So they never got a bill, how a bill becomes a law in 6th or 7th grade, or any of that stuff. We've done like civil rights presentations where we go, hey, this picture of MLK, who knows who this is? Everybody raises their hand. Yeah, that's Martin Luther King. Does everybody know why there's an MLK Day? Yeah, and we usually get a lot of business because people have the day off. Does anyone know why there is an MLK Day? And then all their hands lower, right? But trying to explain some of the backgrounds. And when we've done that training before, it was a great training. It was years ago since I've done it, but like, explaining to some of these folks, the shoulders that folks stand on, folks fighting for rights, which led to people's ability to be here, to be naturalized, to have voting rights, and all those other things. But you need to do that kind of education if you want people to, share their stories to power, and not just tell them what you want to hear, right? But other things, about digital divide, about accessibility of committee hearings, language access. And I put in the bottom there performative engagement, saying like reaching out to the Asian communities, not just the fact that within the AAPI diaspora, there's so much diversity, right? But more that, I oftentimes challenge folks not just to settle for Lunar New Year resolutions and, oh, the person came to my event and they wore a traditional Cambodian outfit and things like that, right? And oftentimes when I work with youth, especially, well, anybody, but especially youth leaders, when about these events, to be like, hey, y'all should not settle for like the selfies and the certificates. Whenever you get a chance to reach from these folks, you should be asking them questions and asking them tough questions. And it shouldn't just be, you get the certificate and things like that, right? And, my organization, AAPI Force, we've been involved in a lot of the statewide Stop the Hate, grants that were coming out from the state when that was a reaction to increased violence and hate crime and hate incidents happening in the AAPI community. And, again, challenging folks to more than just throw up colorful hashtags and wear shirts, but how to, follow up and, mean some of that. But this is from Asian Health Services. But just pointing out the part with the language access is that Asian Health Services, every couple of years does these general meetings with their patients in these large auditoriums at a place space. And they have the headsets and connect folks and do simultaneous interpretation. Not just as a way of getting info out to them, but at times we've had like mayors, members of Congress, other elected officials and leaders be there to be able to hear feedback and folks to ask questions, right? And just saying is this is, what I'd say is definitely like, close to a best practice as far as reaching out to non-English, speaking, communities. And there's, a lot that could be done in that frame. But, just finding different ways to do that now. Again, when I was at Asian Health Services, we'd hear from staff who'd say, hey, somebody got these things that were probably just copied and pasted into Google Translate, and they're really unreadable. So for a lot of that, oftentimes the staff at Asian Health Services would take it upon themselves to redo translations in some of these different communities so that they're legible for folks, right? Last thing I'll say is, and I know it's a mixed group here at NECRA. Again, not trying to call anybody except for the A's, because I'm a recovering A's fan, and like how that all went. But just knowing that, as things come to decision points for a lot of these, projects, public or private, whether it being folks getting, garbage or recycling contracts, or, big buildings getting their building permits, or a, multi-billion-dollar, baseball. I'm still kind of sour about how the A's thing, but, I'll digress. But just saying is, as those things happen, what we usually see happen is there's an increase in, public appearances, lobbyists, pushes for things like, community benefits, community benefit agreements, or side deals being made. And then also things like, companies tend to suddenly start seeing an increase of them wanting to, like buy a table at your gala and things like that in order to in order to uh, you know secure support, right? But I also say is that usually if those, so a lot of times when those things happen, somebody gets the contract, a lot of that stuff goes away, at least for a while, right? And I'll just say is that um, like everything else, those relationships should be ongoing, and not just when a big decision point is happening. But that happens a lot with some of these processes. You could also say it happens with elections, but I wasn't going to be too political during these conversations, but just wanted to mention that. And last but not least, yeah, if there was anything about what I had mentioned, if any of that was of interest, whether with your day job hats or not, feel free to reach out. So.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was great. And I do apologize. We only have about 7 minutes left to our webinar today. The both presentations were so engaging that I wasn't keeping track of time, so I do apologize about that. But does anyone have any questions or just comments? Feel free to just unmute and speak up.
I have a quick question for Mike. Mike, you said that you were sort of demonstrating some of the barriers or ways in which people reach out. And you mentioned postcards in the mail as the first thing. And I'm curious, I work for a marketing creative agency that works on a lot of environmental initiatives, and we often do direct mail, not necessarily to engage them in a workshop or something like that, but just direct mail as information. And I'm just curious why that's on there, or what some of the challenges you've found with postcards and direct mailing.
Yeah. And I'm not here to like criticize anyone's strategies, but
Oh yeah, no,
like
yeah.
that, I've seen where direct mail has been a helpful tool, but not like the only tool,
Yep.
right?
Mhm.
And if they're saying it's like, oh well, we put out the postcards, didn't you see our postcard type thing? If that's, I've seen it where that was like the only like it was a standalone tactic for informing the community that stuff was happening. And that's what I meant, like as a stand, like is that if for a lot of these things, if those are like the standalone tactics, mailers just like by themselves, in my experience, it doesn't yield as high of a effectiveness.
Yeah, okay. That,
What do you suggest then, Mike, as an alternative? Because I had the same question as Kara.
Yeah. Well, I'd say is that part of us is that about um, reaching out to like again trusted messengers, organizations, as ways to hopefully amplify that message, right? And I'll just even use Asian Health Services as an example, which has 8 different patient leadership councils for different communities. But like oftentimes being able to present or connect with those leadership councils helped soften the ground a bunch.
I also I'll add to that. Because I was thinking about it and thinking about the tactics that we used to use at SF Environment when I was there with the outreach team, and we would do a mailer, so it might be a letter like for compliance for a new policy or something. It would be translated in multiple languages for small businesses that were, subject to this new law. And then we would follow up in person at those businesses to provide additional support and answer their questions in language as well. But we use those letters or those mailers as a way to sort of introduce the topic. Like, did you get this? It was a really easy intro. And if they hadn't, that's okay, because we would just then launch into, hey, well, no worries about that. I'm here. I can answer any of your questions, and here's why I'm here. But I agree with you, like it doesn't, as a standalone tactic, I 100% agree that it doesn't really make sense. So thank you for elaborating on that, Mike.
Yeah, good question. Thank you so much. Anybody else have questions or comments? I was going to ask both Andrea and Mike. I was wondering, I can't remember if I asked you this in our conversations before, but one of the things I really struggle with here in Sonoma County is that we have mainly like a big Latinx population, but a smaller pockets of like Asian communities and other language speaking communities. And so I've always struggled with trying to decide like how much of our material to translate and into what languages. Like, especially like City of San Diego, I know you guys have a lot of communities. So how do you decide like what languages to translate to?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and that's why I was going back to like sometimes these decisions come down to budget, and sometimes I just don't have enough budget for every single language, and so when we've done it, again, we've been very fortunate. We have a whole division of race and equity that gives us advice, and so we use data. It also depends on where the outreach is needed, right? If you're trying to just certain neighborhoods, because there's maybe, for example, working on contamination, we know there's certain contamination and based on feedback that we have from the haulers and from our own drivers, we know that certain neighborhoods, and if we know the demographics of that neighborhood, then the information is translating that language of that neighborhood. If it's something that's citywide, I think it depends on budget, right? If you have a generous budget, I would say translate in more languages, right? The more inclusive that you can make it, it's about. I'm always trying to think about access, right? Does someone have access to this if they need to? And if that gives access to those communities who have historically not been able to participate, then I think it's worth the investment of that funds. But again, it comes also to asking, right? Asking the community, asking those trusted community-based organizations, asking folks who work in that community what they would need or would like. And I think that's my big takeaway is like I try never to always assume going forward, right? It's about, and that's why I put on my slide. There's questions to pause, and sometimes pausing takes time, and please include that into that time that you're using in your planning process because it's worth it. And also pivot if needed, right? Sometimes we try things that doesn't work, and it's not like all right, give up, right? It's like, hey, do we have enough information or data to show that can we try it again? Can we pilot it small, right? And I would always encourage that to try it on a small, if budget is a concern, or if buy-in is a concern too, right? Since I think at the top of the meeting you mentioned that sometimes there's differing ideas of what does equity look like, right? Or if you don't have that buy-in, at least try it. Maybe somebody can say, let's start small. If this works successfully, I'd like to expand it. But I don't, Mike, do you have thoughts on that too?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what you said, Andrea. Obviously, in terms of time, budget is always a concern, but I think is, if from a targeted perspective, looking at like, oh, who's participating in these different programs and wanting to, genuinely wanting to change that, um, you know, um, looking at targeted strategies, whether it being again, finding trusted messengers, organizations, churches, things like that. And in my various hats, my organizations have been reached out to try to do some of that. My organization has also been reached out to sometimes and say, oh, we talked to Asian Health Services, like so they could check it off the box. But we try hopefully to have it be more to the former than the latter.
So just real quick, it is 101. So Andrea and Mike, if you're willing to stay, we can continue chatting, but don't want to hold you up. And then same for all our participants. If you want to stay and chat for just a few minutes longer, you can. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. So I was gonna ask really quick to Andrea, with the, what did you call it? The Division of Equity and Race at the City of San Diego. Are those full-time employees in the division, that are just working on equity, or are they like, do they have other jobs and this is just sort of like what they do on the side?
Yes, this is something that was just recently, like most 4 years or so ago. They're full-time employees, and they have some team members who are dedicated to certain departments. Like some are dedicated to police and fire, some are dedicated to my department, and some others. But um, I know that, yeah, we're politically very lucky that we still have that division. It has unfortunately downsized because of some budget constraints, but we've been fortunate that politically our council members and our mayor have decided this was important to prioritize and be included as part of, and they framed it as part of it's being part of the budget process too, and also HR. They're embedded within HR too, and they also have ties into the independent budget analyst also as well. But yeah, happy to stay on if anyone else has any questions or thoughts. Otherwise, really appreciate the opportunity and the space to meet and talk with all of you and hear from you also as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Otherwise, I have more. Okay. If not, I guess this was more of like a comment. I've been thinking a lot about equity with like our programs, and I just feel like what you were saying about evening events just really resonated with me. I didn't really think about, with the elderly, or just like, yeah, people who are older not feeling safe during the evening. But one aspect that's kind of related, I found out in Sonoma County. One of our cities used to be a sundown town, so a lot of the Black community didn't feel safe coming out to events in the evening. If you're not familiar with sundown towns, it's from the Jim Crow era, where basically if you're Black and you're out after sunset, then it's very dangerous for you. And so, yeah, just small things like that. I think a lot of people still don't understand like generational trauma and the distrust of government. So it's just something that I'm struggling with to educate my supervisor and our agency to try to do better.
Yeah, hopefully since like whether it's referring to San Diego, I know that there's many other jurisdictions who are trying this, and I know it changes. It's uncomfortable. I'll tell you straight up, it's uncomfortable. It depends on leadership too. We had it mandatory for all executive team members, and we participated in this kind of training and looking at inwards before we even could talk externally. We had to address internal like racism and classism, all the isms, but also creating a space of grace and forgiveness. And we're not asking everyone to be experts, and just starting from there too. Just because some folks feel like this kind of conversation will be very exclusive too. Like I don't have the education to talk about it that way, or I don't know. And we're just grounding people of like we got to start somewhere. Be okay with these uncomfortable conversations, and that hopefully pointing some best practices like folks in this who's attending here to amplify. Hopefully we'll move them along. And then to what Mike was sharing too is like, as much visibility that you can have with other trusted community-based organizations to be present, hopefully will also be helpful as well. Mike, I really like that you talked about having like relationships are ongoing. I agree too. I think I've seen in other spaces where people like check off that box, and I'm just like, like what happened at such and such group, or what about that feedback? And I think we've heard that from our results too, that folks said, okay, participate, I gave us all this data. What are you doing with this? How am I gonna know the results? So I'm really glad you brought up those points.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that training maybe is just that first step that all of us have to take, because so many people don't really understand, like even when you're opening your presentation about like the difference between equity versus equality and why those things matter. And I've just had so many conversations with people, especially when I used to live in the Midwest, where people were really resentful of affirmative action or like Title IX and not understanding like why do they get special privileges? It's like, well, how do I explain this? Um, yeah, so it's really tough. I think even just like I mentioned before people are hopping on, I had a conversation with my supervisor yesterday, and it was clear that she just didn't understand like why equity is important, and just I think that training is probably that first step that we have to do.
Yeah, well, we did a implicit bias training at the department when I was there, and it was really very helpful. I think I'm sure you have a lot of connections with SF Environment folks. I can't remember, I can't, I can't remember the agency that did it, but it was very helpful. It just that moment just to reflect on what are our internal biases so that we can at least be aware of them as we're, creating programs, creating policy, whatever it was. Very, very helpful. And very helpful for like leadership at the time. Because even our leadership didn't really have an understanding of why this work is important.
Mhm.
That's tough. It can also be exhausting, right? Like doing that emotional work to try to get folks there. So I hope everyone continues to give each other, at least I tell myself to give ourselves grace, right? Like it's going to be frustrating, it's going to be challenging, but these are important conversations and they're worthwhile, and you got to start somewhere. And I apologize, I have to step out to attend another appointment. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for the space and time. And I appreciate that. I think it's so cool that NICRA has the salon that's focused on DEI. I got to figure out how to bring that to Southern California some more. So you guys are also inspiring me down here. So keep it up. And again, I saw some chats, so and I'll try to get in touch with folks as a follow-up. Thank you.
That sounds good. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Kara.
Bye, y'all.
All right. Well, I suppose we'll just leave it at that. It's 10 past. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining us as well, and all of you for listening in. So we'll have another one of these soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Bye.